Hi, Rob. Thanks for doing this. And for everybody's knowledge, I met Rob, has it been 10 years or 15 years ago when he came to Hong Kong, like with Sapient, and we worked on a project together for like a luxury project, right? We went mystery shopping. So why don't you just introduce yourself, like what your background is? We're going to talk more about like your journey. Being, the head of Sapient in research, right? Research and insights, and then now you're more on the data side.
Let's see, my background, I have to go way back just to paint a picture.
Sure.
But I don't know if you know this, but I majored at university in English literature. And my minor was in astronomy.
Astronomy, really?
Yeah. Okay. So I've always had this science and art kind of balance, let's say. And then one of my first jobs in Chicago was at the Museum of Science and Industry. Started out doing grant writing, and then moved into this new internet role where I became the web master. Remember that word? And then worked on exhibit design, but always like, hey, we need that digital thing. So that was a blast. And then I got into advertising and consulting. And then moved into more consulting. I went back to grad school. I mean, there's a story, the Institute of Design in Chicago. And from there, that actually propelled me to New York, where I worked at Citibank in their innovation lab, and then Sapient, running the group where we met, the qualitative research group and strategy, and then now at IBM.
Right now at IBM, and right now it's IBM iX, right?
Correct.
Experience management. Yeah. Okay. So it's more management consulting. Okay.
Correct. I'd say like design management consulting. Yeah.
Design management consulting. Okay. You're telling us your age, Rob.
No, I did this all in 5 years. It's really incredible. It's been, I am exhausted.
Okay. Can you tell us what you do now? Like, what's your major role in the company?
So the role now, like you said, we knew each other when I was working in more qualitative ethnographic research, interviewing people, in one-to-one or very, very small groups, mystery shopping, all that. My role at IBM is very different. The role is experience strategy broadly, but what that really means in Earth language is I work with teams. I know sometimes our titles. I work with teams to help them identify and get data, subjective data. So it's still the same sort of role, but we're not doing qualitative research. But I'm trying to be, and I am on a good day, the advocate for voice of the employee, voice of the customer for clients who may or may not have programs, software, tools, methods to really do it, or they're doing it at sort of a okay level, and they could do far more. So I work with a couple different vendors, and these vendors are really focused on bringing in that subjective data, as I call it. The subjective data that could be like Net Promoter Score, NPS, or CSAT, customer satisfaction, or customer effort, like, did you succeed in, buying the shoes? So these things are trying to bring in a voice of the customer. Are you satisfied? Would you recommend it? Those that try to understand what people are thinking, feeling, saying, and doing is what we're really ultimately trying to do, and using different methods. You and I, back in the day, would have used, and still do, personas, journeys, and artifacts like empathy maps. And we're still doing that. There's lots of UX designers at IBM who use these sorts of frameworks to do the types of design and business strategy. But we're also trying to systematize how we bring in that subjective data. There's plenty of objective data, the systems data, Google Analytics, just anything that's like a system of record that just says, this is what's happening. And then my group really works on trying to bring in and apply, because some of it's not just a software thing. It's, people have to understand what to do, how to ask the right questions. It's still very much like research. What are your objectives? Who are you talking to? What do you want to learn? What are you going to do with this? How do you define an insight? How do you get to an insight? And then how do you turn those into actions and business, blah, blah, blah. So it's really just turning what we did together. It's sort of at scale, because IBM and the clients and the projects can be rather large. So just sending you and I into the field might not be the best way to do it. So we're trying to do it that way. So I'm working more in, I'd say, data and insights.
Okay, so just to clarify for the audience, so IBM, like your company, it's a management consulting company to like large businesses, right? Whether it's financial institutes or government or right, and in it. And I also know that you guys build the systems, right, or implements the whatever you guys recommend with them. That's why
if it calls for that, and often that's a big part of our business, is that we would call it the end-to-end solution, where we're doing the upfront strategy, research, discovery, strategy, and then applying that based on those findings. Sometimes clients come to us, we need a new thing, and then we help navigate that, and then would do it and maybe even run it. So depending on what that thing is, but these big technology platforms, there's other parts of IBM that are still doing some hardware, servers. IBM's huge. It's just huge, and global. So this group is, like you said, that consulting world, and then it's really GBS, Global Business Services, is in a sense consulting. And there are some proprietary tools and methods, things like Watson that we'll use. But the IX group that I'm in focuses on, I would call it experience design and experience strategy. We're really trying to put it could be the customer or it could be an employee at the center, and then what does that person need? So it's the same thing, trying to identify needs. So we're much more, let me put it this way. People at IBM look at me and I would call them old time IBM guys. And they'll say, you're a designer. I'm like, well, I'm not really a designer. And I'm not really a researcher, but to them, it's like you either do this thing or you're with those design people, the designy thing. And we use design thinking. That's something that IBM adopted well before I started, out of Stanford. Worked with them in a group in Austin, because there's a group in, sorry to get too complex, but IBM can consult, but also IBM makes things, makes products, software, etc. And those products have designers and sales teams, and separate part of IBM that we can access, but we're agnostic. And those designers really embrace design thinking, to be empathetic, thoughtful, to work agile, et cetera, iterative. Right. And that methodology, design thinking, was adopted by the Global Business Services. So like 200,000 people were trained over X number of years to do design thinking. So we use that as a methodology for problem solving. Yeah, sorry.
All the business people also get it.
Oh yeah, it's not considered something like over there. Like the business people will really understand design thinking, and the clients, like we've talked about, it's not a new thing necessarily, and especially North America, but I would say globally with our clients, people are very familiar with some of the tenets. I know it can vary, but most people would at least say they have some design thinking, or they've done something like that, and so it's good because they understand the language. We're not selling them on a methodology. They're like, yeah, we like that. Let's apply that to this problem.
Can you clarify, just now you said subjective data, and is there objective data, and how that's different, and what are the pros and cons, for example?
So objective data, let me pick insurance. So objective data would be, what type of insurance do you have? You have health insurance, you have car insurance, you have this insurance. How often do you pay? Do you use a credit card? Do you do some other form of payment? When did you start? how old are you, your demographics. That's all objective data. Like
Right.
no one can argue with that, but it's
Sort of
just
like traditional surveys, right?
collected by systems. But subjective data would be something, yes, collected by a survey, something that you are saying, well, yes, I've been a customer, but I don't really like this company. I mean, whatever. So if you can collect that data, that attitude, the behavioral data, then and merge it with that objective data,
Right.
and you have a better story of what's going on. Because you really want to get a picture of, and it's hard at scale. That's the problem. If you had a small business or a restaurant, you're talking to the customers. When we used to go to restaurants, at a fancy restaurant that we might go out for, expense meal, there's invariably, you have your waiter, you have a waitress, you have all these like people, but invariably somebody comes and touches you on the arm, and it's maybe the manager, and he says, "Is everything okay here?" And he or she wants to hear directly from the customers what's going on. Scale that up to a giant company, and no one has the time to touch you on the shoulder and sit down with you and say, "How's it going? Are you okay?" So you need systems to bring that data in, and that's what I try to bring. But you also asked the question, the pros and cons of objective, subjective. I would say it's not about a pro and a con. I think most people would agree you need both. It can be hard to get that information. People will use phrases like, wrestling with the data. Sometimes it takes time. You need special data scientists to bring data together. But anyway, but a strategist, a designer, anybody making decisions about what to build, product designers, marketers, engineers need to know what's happening and what are people doing with this thing we're designing, to help their life, improve their life, sell them something. So I would say you need both types of data to tell the full story. Yes.
And then, so you mentioned like in the larger company, it's hard to get qualitative data to scale. That's such a subjective part of it. So how do you actually use the data afterwards? Like, in the past, with such ethnography type of methods, what you get really, it's not just data, it's insights, right?
Right.
It's insights to inspire innovation, right?
Right.
So if you can't scale it, how do you get inspired? Like, how do you?
That's a great question. So yeah, and let's make a huge distinction between data, numbers, percentages, pie charts, etc., with insights. So when I worked at Sapient, I worked with the great Todd Cherkassky, who's part of Epic, and he has a simple 2x2. That's his definition for an insight, and it's a intersection of something that is both. So let's say you have an observation from any kind of research, objective, subjective. It is the intersection of something that is both important and interesting. So insight isn't just 77% of people do this thing. The insight is 77% of people do this thing because, and like therefore. So people will say an insight should imply an action, but something that's important to the business. The business needs to know this, and then the sort of interesting part is something that is, we didn't know that before.
Yeah, it's more like aha moment. It's like
exactly when we all kind of know it when we dance around like the definition of an insight, and then everyone has like examples of them. When I worked at DDB, and they were training people how to, I was learning about like what's an insight and what creative insight, and they had from some research they said people who like chocolate don't trust people who don't like chocolate. And when you think about it, you're like, that's kind of interesting. And then that became like they can turn that into a creative idea. So, almost implied an action for, somebody selling chocolate. So anyway, the insight is important, but the way you're scaling these things, sometimes it is data. Sometimes it's something's wrong, we need to fix it. That's not insightful. That's just, there's something wrong, we need to fix it. And these subjective data gathering tools and the ways that you process them and the methods can help feed that kind of UX, CX system that always needs to know, is something broken? Do we need to fix something? Do I need to intervene in the customer or employee journey to provide new information to help guide someone to do something? So those systems might not be always generating like insights like you and I know. They could, but I also have a way to think about insights is it's when you have different types of data come together. And that sometimes gets you to an insight. You know, when someone says that person's really insightful, or they think different, or they connect the dots, those are all phrases about someone, you know, a thinker, a strategist who is looking at a really broad spectrum of data, objectively, no difference what that is, and then seeing these patterns. And that's what we really do. We look for patterns in the data, and we look for something that really stands out, try to understand what's happening, like a scientist, what's driving that, what's causing it, what are the underlying influences, and then it's like, what can I do with it? So you have to understand these systems can help kind of in a UX way, CX way, but also ultimately in that insightful way. Then that's right.
Right. Yeah. UX for user experience and CX for customer experience, right? Okay.
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, user experience and then the customer experience.
Yeah. And remember, like when we did ethnography together in Hong Kong, we went to one luxury shop, and the sales lady was like, "Oh, you know, this standard handbag, you know, costs this much, and it's an investment, right? Because the price never goes down; it always goes up." You know, these type of things, you need to be in context, go there to even know it, like, right? Sometimes for even through interviewing remote, you might not see the context, right? So one question for you is like, how has things changed with COVID when everything is so remote, right? Yeah.
Well, so like I mentioned earlier, I don't do qualitative research directly anymore, but I would still say that anybody at IBM, or especially anybody at IBM, like you have to be curious, and anyone in this industry, anyone who's watching this video, like it's that natural curiosity that you get at that, trying to understand the context. So even though we can't necessarily go do the same thing, go into people's homes for 2 hours and talk to them, you know, and do all sorts of activities and methods, I think there's the remote nature that, you know, just like this, but I still think that you have to get out and you have to understand what the larger context. So there was another company, actually a woman who has a company, Kathleen Brandenburg of IA Collaborative, really, really solid user-centered design company, like will fall on their sword for user-centered design. And she always said to all employees, like, you have to go live this brand experience, no matter what it is. It could be a space shuttle. Go learn everything you can about being an astronaut, even though we're just designing this little thing. Trains, shoot, whatever they would help design. She made sure that everyone on the team used the product, you know, understood, went to the store, etc. So I guess the point is, in these times, I think you have to do everything you can, get out into the real world safely, but also just read things and have a broad aperture of trying to get at that context. Because you're right, that is the key word. We're always trying to get to insights. It's our goal. But I don't think you can get there without the context. And that is a great example. Unless we went into those stores and did that observational first-person research, really scenario research, we wouldn't have learned, you know, nearly as much as quickly as if we talked to, you know, 20 people or read 50 reports.
Right. Okay. Cool. And you mentioned about Watson's. So it's AI, you know, data, big data stuff. Can you explain more about that and how that helps with business or design strategies?
Sure. And I'm learning, you know, it's a journey for me as well, because I've had to learn a lot about that and how.
Are we going to be replaced?
No, no, no. Don't worry, because it's here's the first thing that I've learned about AI. It's really hard. It's
Really hard
really difficult, and it's mostly a
for computers to be intelligent, or
yes.
okay.
And the definition of intelligence too is really the operative word there, because these are really a series of algorithms that you train.
Uh-huh.
You train to get to the answer. And I've used some systems and had access to one that I'll tell you about that used Watson Discovery. Watson Discovery uses natural language processing and natural language understanding to, in a sense, understand unstructured data. So this is how I think of AI and our world coming together. The unstructured data could be documents, could be audio files, could be video files, meaning it's that in a sense not objective data necessarily, but it's that it's not in a chart, it's not in a database. Like that's easy for all these companies to kind of go look at, Excel. So everything's in a little cell. But what if you have a PowerPoint, a PDF, and a thing, and you have thousands of them and thousands of them? So you can teach algorithms to read and understand the semantics of words, which can be really difficult. So Watson will create language packs for specific industries. And you can imagine automotive and insurance, et cetera, have very specific languages. Where it comes to us, I should say, here's the analogy that actually made a lot of news was Watson was being used in this way to look at a lot of unstructured data, massive amounts in healthcare, to help doctors and researchers process all this data that was being published around the world, different languages, because doctors don't have that much time, or these researchers don't have a lot of time. So how do you get that new knowledge in their head? So this is helping to sort of process and save some time, maybe validate some decisions, give them some literally insights or something. But you have to train a computer to do that. You need what they call a corpus of data. And then you train it to read. And when I use something like this for a very small project, every time you asked the system a question, and it looked at this data that I'll tell you about, then it asked, was it right? Because all it was doing, in a sense, AI and machine learning, I should say, is really about categorization and prediction. So it categorizes all this data. And then when you ask a question, it uses that to go look for what it thinks the answer is. And then it gives you a answer that it will always have a percentage. It'll say in this little text box, it'll say, here's the article that probably answers your question. We're 97% confident. And then you have to say yes or no. And I remember when I would say no, then I would get an email from one of the system designers. He's like, okay, why was it wrong? Like, you got to tell me why it was wrong. I'm like, this is going to take forever. But as like it got smarter,
getting a structured male brain into a female fuzzy brain, right?
That is a perfect analogy. But think of it in our world, and I've talked to a lot of clients about this. They have all this great data that people like you and I have done, and we submit PowerPoints and keynotes and PDFs, and we do like videos. There could be audio files, there could be transcripts, and a lot of that sits in some folder somewhere. Now, assuming it's digital now, so it's all sitting in some folder. Back in the day, that was like some big thud book, but now this research sits in a folder. Someone may or may not access it again. It doesn't necessarily fit into a database. It just sort of sits in a folder. It's searchable, maybe it's tagged, but is anyone really using it? And can anyone reuse it and merge it with other stuff? That's where AI for researchers, I think, presents a huge opportunity, because you could, at a very simple level, and that's what I was doing when I was looking at this. We just took a bunch of research and secondary research, because we needed to get smart on some topic really quickly. It's for a business pitch, and no one really knew this industry. And we had everyone in the team was sending each other documents about this industry. No one had time to read things. And it was, oh my God, this is really good. You should read this. Like, no one had time. So I said, maybe we could use this tool to help synthesize and pull out some things. It was harder than I thought, but that's where this is going for us. It's like all the qualitative research that we're doing and the observational data. Again, it could be just a transcript of video, and then bringing in any of the other data and secondary research. Again, articles, videos, news, reports, whatever, and trying to bring that together. I also tried to do this for, at the end of the year, like it'll start now when it's starting. All the consulting companies, all the design firms, all the banks, everyone will come out with their 2021 predictions. Some beautiful design PDF, right?
Yeah.
And I will collect them all. I learned this from my friend Gabe at Sapient, because he used to do this all the time. He was just a sponge. And he would stay up late reading this stuff. I'm like, I can't do that. So what I've started to do is collect everything, put it into a box folder, and then try to scan it using these tools to pull out some of the patterns. We used to do that manually, and we all still more or less do that. Everyone tries to absorb stuff, look for the connections, because your brain sees it all. But anyway, that's where one way that AI, I think, could really help designers and researchers.
Is getting patterns from massive amounts of data, right?
Right.
In different formats, basically. Right?
It could be in very, very different formats, yeah. But again, I have to emphasize, it takes work to train it to what an answer is, and especially when you get into maybe our world. So it's not even the world of research. It's what is the world that you're studying? Are you studying luxury? Are you studying automotive? What languages are involved? Is everything in English? Usually that's not how things work in the global world. So these things could really help do that. I mean, I've seen people use Google Translate some document from something and then say, that's good enough. We'll just use this. I'm like, no, there's got to be a better way. So Watson actually has a translation tool that can translate audio, translate video, etc. So Watson can help. Again, it's powerful algorithms that are like saving time. And Watson isn't just one thing. There's a number of different products that make up Watson. And these are the things that we all at IBM have to learn about. And here's the last thing I want to say about AI is that because I always thought it's all about data science. And I had a friend who wanted to get into data science, but he's like, but I'm not really like a data guy. I don't program in Python, etc. And I talked to one of the heads of AI at IBM, and he said, he's like, everyone thinks it's data scientists. He's like, what I need are people that understand statistics and linguistics. Like, this is so much about language, and then the patterns of statistics of what constitutes, confidence, etc. He's like, that's the concept. That's what makes in a sense, a good data scientist working in kind of AI and machine learning.
Right.
Which really made me think this is way more art than science. And our worlds are much closer together. So I would just say, if you're in research or design, business, don't be afraid of this thing. It's not going to take over the world. It's fascinating. And the concepts of how AI works are all the underlying concepts of how you and I process data, no matter where it comes from, process data and get to an insight. Right. Semantics, phenomenology, all those words, everything that we kind of do, processing data and organizing it, looking for those patterns, that's what you're trying to train a machine to do. So I contend that researchers and strategists and designers are actually perfectly suited to work, in the world of AI, and actually should. I actually think there could be a connection between musicians too, but just a hypothesis.
Musicians? How's that connected?
Because there's a way that they think, and the language of music. I mean, I'm not there yet because I don't understand music, but the way that they think and the pattern recognition, but more just, I think the way that they think, with a couple other concepts and disciplines, I think could be, if someone had music as their core and had a couple of other disciplines around it, I think that can be really useful for understanding, again, those concepts that drive machine learning, and then again applying it to some industry.
Yeah, it makes me think of, I constantly have to, when we explain to, more junior designers, like what is recognizing patterns, it's like, the movie, The Beautiful Mind.
Mm-hmm.
There's this scene where, the protagonist looks at this wall of all these numbers, and then suddenly he goes, ding, I see this pattern, right? It's sort of how, but it's not analytical, it's not linear, it's like recognizing patterns, right?
Mm-hmm. That's called the crazy wall.
Crazy wall. Okay.
In movies and TV shows, there are so many examples of the crazy wall. That's the perfect one. But where someone has pictures in yarn, going everywhere. We do it with Post-it notes.
Yes.
But it's those that it's our trope in a movie, but it is right. People want to see it on a big wall.
Yeah.
And what was that one movie with Minority Report with Tom Cruise? Where he's wearing the gloves and he's just using his hands and gestures to go through all this visual data. Yeah, there's great examples in movies and TV that it doesn't matter if they're right or wrong or come true, but they're trying to communicate, simply, because that's the job of TV and movies. Like, they can't just constantly talk at you, so they have to use visuals to tell the story. But it's also how we think. That's why we react to that. We're like, oh yeah, detectives, they must have yarn and pictures in police stations. I don't know if they do or not, but on TV they always do.
Yes. So well, going back a little bit is like, so I've noticed, like, in the past, I don't know, 5 years or so, like, designers moved to management consulting, right? It wasn't like that before. It's all these management consultings have been acquiring, like, design firms and all that all over the place. Yeah, what is it that about designers or researchers, what kind of skills that makes them valuable for management consulting?
The easiest one is that I think designers are not necessarily linear thinkers, and that business consultants are more mathy and tend to be a little bit more process and linear. And I know there's an agile process for DevOps and creating software, but I think designers have always worked in an agile way.
Yeah.
That's why the loop is used in design thinking and a big part of it. But I just think that designers, and that's why design thinking, it's like the wrong word. It's like, oh, think like a designer, design the think. Like, at first it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But it really is just a problem solving methodology. And I think it's based on how designers do their process. But I go further to say designers tend to be obviously visual, maybe not obviously, but can be very visual. And given the skills that they have and the concepts that drive them, are good at problem solving. And that's where, when you combine these different disciplines, somebody who does understand the math and somebody who does understand design and unstructured things, that's when you can get some real magic.
Right. So other cultural shocks combining these different cultures?
In what way? I say more. What do you mean?
Well, like the mathy, actually, even back in the 90s, and the first acquisition wave by, even companies like Sapient acquired, like, Clement Mock Studios, you remember?
Yeah. I mean, that was before I was there, but yeah.
The first clash, right? That was the first culture clash where, companies got acquired, old designers fled, and then now it's like another wave of acquisition is by the management consultants buying out the design companies, design firms, right? So and the way people work could be quite different, right?
Oh, very, very different. IBM bought a company in Columbus, a really good design firm called Resource Amirate in Columbus, Ohio, which is, you know where that is. So that was a bit of a culture clash.
Oh, okay.
And so that was, I got to see that firsthand. But you could see where people were either curious to understand IBM, or they were more, why did this happen? Why is IBM here? And I think that sort of, I don't know, it was a self-selecting population. Some people moved on, and that
Uh,
happens no matter what. I saw that at Sapient. I saw that literally every place I've worked where there was an acquisition, where people have a really tight culture. But
wow.
IBM is pretty open. I think that people had more fear of IBM based on some idea of it
Uh,
rather than the reality of it. Because I find most people at IBM completely open and nice and design thinkers, and but this was a really serious, like, design driven, like designs were like all over the walls, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a little bit of tension there, but eventually it sorted itself out.
okay. Interesting. So I think one last question for you is like based on all that you talked about, what skills do designers need to upgrade to, or maybe even move on to not become a designer anymore? I don't know. Um, like with the upcoming technologies that are kind of taking over, for example, AI, big data, automation, right? Blockchain, all these new trends that are coming that will be shifting industry, right? What kind of skills do you think people need to be aware of to acquire to not be obsolete?
Yeah, I mean, that's great. There's so much written now about continual learning, and that
Mm.
it never ends. It just sounds like it's exhausting. But I think the first thing is anything that can fuel curiosity, because you just have to be curious. If you think about it as continually learning, you're like, it'll never end. And you're constantly going to school. But I don't know if there's any one skill. I would go back to understand some of the concepts of say AI, like statistics and linguistics. I mean,
Mm.
understand that, like, Wikipedia level, the deep Wikipedia level of these concepts, and then see where you naturally might see a fit, etc. But it's
So,
not like I'm thinking people
uh-huh.
need to learn calculus or something. But there is one discipline I think that's helped me a lot. I don't know if those help designers, but because I think communication is where sometimes we fall down. So there's skills that I think you need to gather, and I think there's other skills that are just even more important now because of this. And talking about like culture clashes, etc., which there's also just going to be more. And I think writing is a big one. I think learning
Mm-hmm.
to write and being good at it and understanding it, whatever your language, is quite important. And
Right.
sometimes that can be visual, but sometimes it is, just language. Because any analyst, I think, you need to have that common vocabulary.
Mm.
Analyst, designer, what I mean is like anyone processing like a bunch of data. And so I think that would always help. I took a class in reader-based writing, they called it. And it
Oh,
was the first user-centered design. They didn't use that term. It's the first user-centered design thing I've ever come across, reader-based writing. And it just improved my writing, within weeks, because it just said, this isn't random. Like, this is how this works. I can teach you to do this thing. People look for the verb and a noun, subject, adjective in a certain place. And if they don't see it in a certain place, they will do one of two things. They will slow down
uh-huh.
or they'll stop.
Mhm.
And you in business, because this is for business, this person said, the professor said, you don't want people to stop reading your thing because you probably want them to do something, no matter what it is. And then he had all these methods and tools to help to do that. And everyone's writing got better. And I noticed it, my boss noticed it. It was incredible, but it really was the first thing about user-centered design, which is the same thing. If you don't understand the poor user, the consumer, the employee, whoever it is, then no matter what these concepts and tools are, no matter how fancy they are, you're
Mm.
not really going to be successful.
Right.
So I think there's a little bit of the, go old school.
Yeah.
But the other piece I would also say, I'm glad you brought up like all these mergers, acquisitions, etc. I think the biggest skill to help people, not skill like your job skill, but this other right around your job skill is understand. And another boss told me this. He's like, he basically said everyone in the company, there were like 50 people. He's like, you all need to understand exactly how we make money. Because people would come in like, hey, could we hire a thing? Or can we have a Christmas party? Or can we do this thing? He's like, no, or yes, but, or if you need this thing, here's how you make a case. So you really need to understand, a designer at any level, understand.
From trees, like mom said, right?
yeah, exactly. It doesn't grow from trees. And you know, all those nuances I think are just as important for a designer to know, a researcher, or you know, anybody to be aware and to be able to talk about money. And you know, because every culture, as you know, has a weird thing about money. Some overly talk about it, some don't.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot there, in generations and gender, culture, all that stuff comes into play.
It's interesting. All the skills that you mentioned are more left brain skills, like logical type of skills that is sort of not. I mean, historically, you would think of design as more right brain, creative, visual, blah, blah, emotional. But it seems like, you know, we need more skills on the other side of the brain.
It's ultimately, I mean, that's the advice I think we always give each other is like, don't forget this thing that isn't your core. Go back to some old school thing, or there's this new thing you haven't thought about, go learn about that. And you know, AI might be one of them, and there's so many. But you know, I just always go back to that other thing that designers are good at, which is just be curious. Designers will always have, you know, like if you've ever worked with a print designer, that print designer has physical manifestations of print and books and, you know, magazines, etc., art. And I think the more, we always say cross discipline, you know, right, left, that's where the magic is. You know, we always say we put together a cross disciplinary team, and that's what it is. We have the right and the left come together, business, art, the business design.
Right. The Leonardo da Vinci of the
kind of. I mean, everyone wants a unicorn or whatever, or you know, these rock stars, and that's it. Those are the things that become in your tool set, you know, and you always need to keep them fueled, because it can be hard to, and you'll lose that inspiration, you'll lose that curiosity, you know, a little bit every time there is like a weird merger or a job shift or yet another skill you have to learn, or new software or something. But if you approach it from, you know, more like, hey, this is delightful, easier said than done. But there's so much out there that's really is inspiring right now that I think designers should take advantage of. VR helmets. I have my Oculus, you know.
Oh, we're thinking of making China to virtual. We'll see how that can be done, but
that would be amazing.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll experiment. Yeah.
So it's things like that. Like sometimes as an early adopter, you waste a lot of money. I've had drawers of electronics that was like, that was a mistake. But sometimes it really pays off, and you're just like, oh, this is interesting, and no one is taking advantage of it.
Yeah.
You know, I had I can't say the name out loud, Blablexa, but when I bought Blablexa, my Amazon Echo, you know, it was more about like, what do I use this thing for? And natural discovery just happened because it's there, it is always listening, and it went from just asking the weather to a whole bunch of other things that now, I mean, voice, I mean, maybe that's something. Really think about voice and gesture, because I think that's going to play, especially in COVID. No one wants to touch screens anymore, and or doors, and all these touchscreen kiosks that our whole industry have been touch screens and things. It's like, no,
I'll be waving at everyone now.
I don't want to touch it. So yeah, that's something to really learn, because I don't think that vocabulary is getting set, you know, just yet. Although the Oculus does have a gesture thing, you don't have to use the hand controllers now. They're working on a vocabulary for gesture, which is fascinating.
Awesome. Well, very, very cool. Rob, thanks for spending the time. I love interviewing my friends because I learn so much more than just having a normal conversation, you know?
Oh, I love it. Wait, I have one more quick anecdote for you
Okay.
that I got from this designer at Ford. And I meant to actually just tell you this, offline. But I think it's really good. If this is a good inspirational thing to know, is from what was her name? Susan at Ford in design. So this was one of the few design thinkers at Ford Motor Company, and we had a great conversation with her. And she said, "I have all these engineers that come in to kind of rotate through a lab and do some exercises and work on some projects." But she said some of them are so linear, it's hard to get them to think, to be creative. So she had this one question that she asks. She said, "When is the last time you bought a birthday present for somebody important in your life, wife, husband, spouse, friend, whatever, family member, and you absolutely crushed it? They loved it. It was unexpected. They were like, oh my God, how did you, like, when did you do that?" And hopefully it's a when, not if. And so she has everyone go around and tell a story like that, and then say, how did you do that? How did you know? How did you get to that conclusion? And everyone then starts to learn how they were processing other signals of data from qual and quant, of understanding, what their wife or child or coworker likes, and getting that corpus of data together over time, and then finding the pattern, insight, connecting a dot to a thing, ta-da, or an event or experience, whatever it is. And I thought that was genius. I think that's a great way to help people think about creativity, empathy, and design.
Yeah, if you can surprise your customer like that, right?
Oh, yeah, and designers, I think, know these kind of tricks, but still, it's a fun story, because you want to be able to do something like that. But what's more important than the delight is, how did you get there? What data did you do? What's the process that you went through? Because you went through a process, and you just have to help people understand that they already are creative. They already are curious. So I think sometimes our role as designers and researchers and whatever it is we do, is to help other people get there too, who might say like, oh, I'm not really creative. You creatives do this thing. It's like, no, you're creative. So I think we can teach people more and more to do that. And I know this is exactly what you do. Like, part of the way that you consult is to teach. And you're just such a natural professor, and hats off to you, because we've had so much fun. I learned so much from you. And so again, thank you for all this stuff. I wish we had more time so I could tell all sorts of learning stories.
Awesome. This is really good. Remember to like, subscribe, and share our video so more people can understand how to get into the UX industry.